All right. So, what is ADHD? There are a lot of definitions out there, but I like this one in particular. This is Sari Solden, MS. She defines attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as a lifelong neurobehavioral genetic syndrome that leads to structural, chemical, communication, and arousal differences in the brain that subsequently impact what is called the executive functioning system of the brain. And that's from her book, A Radical Guide for Women with ADHD, which is a fantastic book on ADHD. But that's a mouthful, isn't it? A lifelong neurobehavioral genetic syndrome that leads to structural, chemical, communication, and arousal differences in the brain. Well, let's see what this guy has to say about ADHD.
Oh, hey there, I'm ADHD. A lot of you have been asking if you have me. Well, let's find out, shall we? Have you always been told you were smart, but feel stupid a lot? You're welcome.
Do you get flustered easily or feel like you're too sensitive? That's just me with your emotions.
When you get excited about something, do all of your other responsibilities seem to just disappear? They didn't really. Do you have a addictive personality? Does it sometimes feel like there's a wall between you and the things you need to do? Guess who put it there? If you do have me, there's a chance we'll be together forever. Because even though you're not comfortable, I sure am.
Yeah, that's Eric Whittington. He's one of my most favoritist social media creators. He's an influencer. He's also the founder of an online interactive program to help individuals transcend their limitations called Life Actuator. Life Actuator is his TikTok, YouTube, Instagram handle. And yes, there is definitely misinformation on the socials. But there's also a lot of great information that helps people connect through a shared experience, and it can help spread awareness, understanding, and empathy. And there are a few creators out there who are really doing a good job at that, and Eric is one of them. All right, ADHD, a rose by any other name. Okay, imagine, if you will, if diabetes had been named excessive thirst slash hunger disorder, or ETHD. Okay, this name focuses on two symptoms of the disorder with no reverence for the complexity, seriousness, and actual underlying pathology. You could even imagine the public kind of questioning the legitimacy of its seriousness. I mean, aren't we all really thirsty and hungry sometimes and eat and drink too much? Isn't everybody a little ETHD? But of course, we know diabetes is a very serious condition with significant morbidity and mortality. We understand the complex underlying mechanisms of poorly regulated glucose on the vasculature of the eyes, the heart, the feet, kidneys, central and peripheral nervous systems, and that polydipsia and polyphagia are minor symptoms in the overall picture of the disease. An attitude of indifference or even disbelief towards diabetes in the general public would have significant negative impacts on the outcomes of those suffering from it. It could reduce the number of people seeking treatment or taking their diagnosis seriously. The attitudes, perceptions might be demoralizing to individuals who share their diagnosis only to be invalidated and have their experience belittled. Kind of sounds like gaslighting, doesn't it? Well, imagine if that became a cultural sentiment so pervasive, even the medical community started to buy in. I think you all kind of see where I'm going with this. All right, this is time for a bias check-in. Implicit bias is a form of bias that occurs automatically and unintentionally that nevertheless affects judgments, decisions, and behaviors. And that's according to the National Institutes of Health. So what is implicit bias? What kinds of implicit bias are there? Well, there's racial and ethnicity bias, gender bias, ageism bias, LGBTQIA plus bias, and ableism bias. So let's just take a quick kind of poll. Like, what are your gut feelings about ADHD? Have you ever questioned whether ADHD is real? Have you ever wondered why you might question such a diagnosis? What other mental illnesses or neurodevelopmental disorders or any diagnosed human condition have you questioned the validity of? Okay, disinformation. Let's talk about disinformation for a minute. Disinformation is the deliberate dissemination of malicious content, such as hoaxes or propaganda, and it's designed to spread fear and suspicion. In 1987, ADHD was the target of a massive disinformation campaign put on by the Church of Scientology. But why ADHD? Well, the Church of Scientology is well known for targeting the legitimacy of psychiatry and mental illness in general. But ADHD is really quite an easy target because what we knew about ADHD then was mostly theoretical, really until about the last 20 to 30 years. But also, the symptoms of ADHD make those suffering from it sort of look like bad people. That's from an ableist perspective and can really be easily shamed away as a person's choice. So, why was this campaign so successful? It was led by a psychiatrist. His name he's since passed away, but Dr. Thomas Szasz. He headed up an organization called the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. This is a subdivision of Church of Scientology. And, from a bird's eye view, Citizens Commission on Human Rights, they describe themselves as a watchdog over psychiatry. And that sounds like, okay, well, that sounds okay. Until you kind of pull back the layers a little bit more. But the Citizens Commission on Human Rights is made up of scientists, educators, and et cetera, who are devotees to the Church of Scientology and who, like Dr. Szasz, have rejected the legitimacy of psychiatry, which back in the 50s and maybe early 60s kind of made sense at the time. If you're looking at, the history of psychiatry, I mean, psychiatry has made a lot of mistakes along the way. However, as the science advanced, positions like this stopped making sense unless you consider that psychiatry and mental health services are competition for the business of Church of Scientology. But what made this campaign so successful was that they targeted clinicians to sow doubt about whether or not there was scientific consensus around ADHD. They went and protested national conferences. I mean, they picketed CHAD conferences and all kinds of conferences like that. They appeared on TV talk shows. They went on Donahue. Anybody remember that? Radio shows. They authored books. They published a ton of propaganda. They also illegally distributed that propaganda in clinics and in schools, etc. And it worked. Also, because not only did they do this, but they declared war on Ritalin. And they did that by exaggerating the number and severity of adverse reactions. And they declared that there was massive overprescribing. They also launched lawsuits and threatened them against schools and clinicians. And they filed a $125 million lawsuit against the American Psychiatric Association in 1987 for developing the criteria for ADHD in the DSM-3R. The lawsuits, their legal strategy was to claim that the APA conspired with CHAD and the manufacturer of Ritalin to fabricate this diagnosis to sell Ritalin. There were 4 other lawsuits. They were launched all over the country. And so, this campaign was carried out for a very long time between 1987 and by 2002, all of these lawsuits were thrown out. But the damage to the public and clinical image of ADHD and its treatment was absolutely done. Parents and clinicians, back then stopped or withheld treatment for fear of litigation and pressure from those around them, who were really susceptible to the media attention because, of course, so the thing is, the lawyers who launched these suits were the people who had just taken down big tobacco and asbestos. So this was front page material for a long time. But the damage that was done to this huge cohort of children who, probably were born sometime between the mid to late 60s and maybe the early 2000s, the damage done to the withholding of treatment and diagnosis to those children who their lives could have improved with treatment is beyond words. And by the way, they are adults now, hitting somewhere between the ages of 30 and probably actually more like 60s, hint, hint. But the bias and stigma continues to this day, despite exponential advances in science. So here's the reality. ADHD has been in the medical literature since the 1700s. It had already been an established diagnosis for 200 years when the Church of Scientology launched their campaign. It has been in the DSM in one way or another since the 1960s. It's had a lot of names along the way, including minimal brain damage, deficit of moral character, all kinds of things like that. But major scientific strides have really revealed so much about the disorder since the decade of the brain, which was between 1990 and 2000. And that was when a ton of money was poured into research into the brain because of a House Joint Resolution. And we've known that ADHD persists into adulthood since the 1990s. But adult ADHD didn't make it really into the DSM officially until the fifth edition in 2013. So many people think that ADHD is a trend right now and is currently being overdiagnosed. And although the numbers of diagnoses are rising, the consensus of the research indicates that this is in relation to their rates finally catching up to actual adult prevalence. And it is in large part due to increased awareness, both in the public and clinical setting.